Picture the most attractive person you've ever seen in real life. Not a celebrity, someone you passed on the street or sat across from at a coffee shop or spotted across a crowded room. Your brain registered something in under a fifth of a second. No deliberate analysis, no checklist, just an immediate, involuntary pull of attention. Now here's a question that sounds ridiculous on the surface, but is actually one of the most revealing things you can ask about our species. If you had been born 40,000 years ago and crossed paths with a stranger on the open savanna, would that same ancient brain of yours have felt exactly the same thing? The answer, as it turns out, is far more nuanced, far more surprising, and far more personal than almost anyone expects. And it reaches into the deepest architecture of what it means to be human. Most people, when they picture ancient humans, land somewhere between a museum diorama and a movie monster. Heavy brows, dragging knuckles, matted hair caked in mud. This image has been so thoroughly embedded in popular culture that it's easy to forget it's almost entirely fictional. When forensic scientists apply modern tissue reconstruction techniques to ancient skulls, building up soft tissue layer by layer using statistical data on tissue depth gathered from thousands of contemporary human faces, the results are consistently jarring. Not because the faces look alien, because they don't. Researchers and members of the public who view these reconstructions frequently describe the same reaction. They look like someone who could work at your local library, someone who might argue with you at a town hall meeting, someone completely, unremarkably human. So what's actually going on here? Why does the science keep producing these startlingly familiar-looking faces when our cultural imagination keeps insisting ancient humans must have looked fundamentally different from us? The answer lives at the intersection of evolutionary biology, cognitive neuroscience, and archaeology, and pulling on that thread leads somewhere genuinely remarkable. It reveals that the machinery driving human attraction is not a modern invention. It's ancient in ways that most people have never fully considered. And understanding that fact changes how you see not just ancient humans, but yourself. Let's start with the foundation. Attraction, for all its poetry and cultural complexity, has a biological engine underneath it, and that engine is old. Research conducted across dramatically different cultures, from hunter-gatherer communities in rural Tanzania to urban populations in Japan to indigenous groups in South America, consistently finds a set of preferences that show up everywhere, regardless of language, religion, or social structure. Facial symmetry. Clear, unblemished skin. Certain proportional relationships between the eyes, nose, and mouth. These aren't arbitrary preferences that some ancient fashion editor decided to champion. They are read by the brain as honest biological signals, difficult to fake, expensive to produce, and reliably correlated with things that genuinely mattered to survival and reproduction across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Facial symmetry is perhaps the most well-studied of these signals. During development, from embryo through childhood, the human body is under constant assault from stressors, pathogens, nutritional deficiencies, toxic exposures, parasitic infections. A developing organism that successfully navigates all of these disruptions tends to produce bilateral symmetry, because symmetry is the natural outcome of genes expressing themselves cleanly in a stable environment. Disrupted development leaves its mark as measurable asymmetry. Researchers including Randy Thornhill and Stephen Gangestad have produced substantial evidence that facial symmetry correlates with immune function, developmental stability, and even sperm quality in men. The brain doesn't know any of this explicitly. It simply finds symmetrical faces more appealing, and that preference, across thousands of generations, directed reproductive choices toward healthier partners. Skin quality operates through a similar logic. Contemporary dermatology research has identified that features perceived as clear, even-toned skin, consistent color, smooth texture, absence of lesions correlate strongly with current health status. A person fighting an active infection, carrying a significant parasitic load, or experiencing hormonal disruption often shows those conditions visibly on their skin long before any other symptom becomes obvious. The brain evolved to notice this. Studies by researchers including Bernhard Fink and colleagues at the University of Göttingen have shown that skin evenness may be a more powerful driver of perceived attractiveness than facial structure itself in certain contexts. The eye isn't just scanning for beauty in some abstract aesthetic sense. It's running a health scan. All of which raises the obvious question: were ancient humans subject to these same pressures? The answer is an unambiguous yes, and in some ways more intensely so than modern humans are today. An ancient human navigating the Upper Paleolithic period, living in small, mobile bands, entirely dependent on the health of every group member for collective survival, had far more at stake in mate selection than a modern person swiping through a dating app in a climate-controlled apartment. Choosing a partner with compromised immune function, hidden illness, or poor developmental history wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a potential genetic catastrophe and a practical burden on the entire group. The biological evaluation system that drives attraction didn't emerge despite ancient life's harshness. It emerged because of it. Now here's where things get considerably more complicated than a simple yes or no answer can handle. Because ancient humans is not a single category. It's a sprawling, diverse, chronologically enormous collection of different populations living under different conditions, with different physical characteristics across hundreds of thousands of years of continuous biological change. The popular image tends to collapse all of this into one undifferentiated cave person stereotype, which is roughly as accurate as describing everyone who has ever lived in Europe as looking like a Roman centurion. The variation within what we casually call ancient humans is staggering. Consider Homo sapiens specifically, our own species. The fossil record shows that anatomically modern humans were already present in Africa by at least 300,000 years ago, based on discoveries like the Jebel Irhoud specimens from Morocco. And crucially, these early Homo sapiens already possessed the relatively gracile, delicate-boned facial structure that characterizes modern humans. The pronounced brow ridges, the heavy mid-face projection, the thick skull walls. Those features are characteristic of earlier hominin species and of our sister lineage, the Neanderthals, not of Homo sapiens as a species. Within our own lineage, the heavy-browed cave person look was already becoming an evolutionary memory before we even left Africa. This distinction matters enormously because it means that a Homo sapiens individual from 100,000 years ago, cleaned up and dressed in modern clothing, would almost certainly pass without comment in any contemporary city. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London has emphasized this point in multiple public communications. The gap between ancient Homo sapiens facial morphology and modern facial morphology is far smaller than popular culture assumes. The significant differences visible in the fossil record, the slight reduction in brow ridge prominence, the modest retraction of the lower face, represent subtle refinements, not dramatic transformations. We are not looking back across an uncrossable physical gulf. We're looking at a continuum. Neanderthals are a genuinely separate and far more interesting case. They were a distinct species, or at minimum, a distinct subspecies, a classification that remains actively debated among paleoanthropologists, who shared the landscape with Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years across Europe and Western Asia, before their disappearance approximately 40,000 years ago. They had a recognizably different facial architecture, a large projecting midface that protruded forward, substantial brow ridges that formed a continuous shelf above the eyes, an occipital bun, a distinctive rounded protrusion at the back of the skull, and overall a more robustly built skeleton. By strict contemporary Western beauty standards, this combination of features would register as unusual, perhaps even striking in an unconventional way. But here is the part of the Neanderthal story that most people don't fully absorb. A landmark 2010 study led by Svante Paabo and the team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, followed by the landmark 2018 discovery of a first-generation Neanderthal Homo sapiens hybrid individual, a young woman whose genome showed she had a Neanderthal father and a Homo sapiens mother, confirmed definitively that these two species interbred repeatedly and meaningfully over an extended period. Contemporary people of non-African ancestry carry approximately 1.4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, a legacy of those ancient encounters. This is not accidental genetic contamination. This is attraction, however it expressed itself, producing offspring that survived to have children of their own. What this tells us about ancient standards of attractiveness is genuinely profound. It suggests that whatever cognitive and emotional processing Homo sapiens individuals were using to evaluate potential partners was flexible enough to find Neanderthal individuals appealing, or, at minimum, not categorically off-limits under the right circumstances. Perhaps familiarity and proximity mattered more than morphological difference. Perhaps there were individual Neanderthals whose particular combination of features aligned with the broad biological signals of health and robustness that the Homo sapiens attraction system was already primed to read favorably. We can't know the specific calculus, but the genetic evidence makes the outcome undeniable. There was enough attraction, in enough encounters, over enough time, to leave a permanent mark in the human genome that you might be carrying right now. Set aside interspecies interactions for a moment and consider something far more concrete: the deliberate, labor-intensive investment that ancient humans made in their own appearance. Because this is where the archaeological record becomes genuinely extraordinary. The impulse to enhance, modify, and present oneself attractively is not a product of Instagram or the fashion industry, or even the ancient Mediterranean civilizations most people think of as the cradle of beauty culture. It goes back much, much further than that, and the evidence for it is sitting in museums around the world. The use of red ochre, iron oxide pigment ground into a fine powder, as a body cosmetic, has been documented at sites going back at least 100,000 years in Africa. Blombos Cave in South Africa has yielded not just ochre, but actual ochre processing toolkits. Abalone shells used as mixing palettes, bones used as applicators, ochre cakes ground down from repeated use. This isn't incidental contamination or purely symbolic burial practice. This is the archaeological signature of people preparing cosmetics with the same purposeful intentionality as someone opening a makeup case this morning. The specific deep red-orange color that ochre produces has been independently used for personal adornment across an extraordinary range of unconnected ancient cultures, which itself suggests something about the deep evolutionary roots of color preference and self-presentation. Personal jewelry pushes the evidence even earlier. A collection of perforated Nassarius shell beads from School Cave in Israel dates to approximately 100,000 to 135,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known personal ornaments ever found anywhere on Earth. Creating them required finding shells of the right size, piercing them with a pointed tool without shattering them, threading them onto fiber or sinew, and wearing them in a way that displayed them publicly. None of those steps serve any purely practical survival function. Every one of them is about appearance, about signaling something to other people about who you are, what you're worth, and how you should be perceived. Archaeological sites from roughly the same period in Morocco have produced similar beads, suggesting this impulse towards self-decoration was geographically widespread, not a local quirk. The question of hair is particularly fascinating and particularly underappreciated in this conversation. We tend not to think much about ancient human hair care because hair rarely preserves in the fossil record. But the tools used to manage hair do. Archaeologists have recovered fine-toothed combs carved from bone and ivory at sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, with some examples dating back thousands of years into prehistoric periods. Fine-toothed combs serve one purpose above almost all others: detangling and grooming hair to a smooth, presentable state. They require skilled crafting, significant material investment, and ongoing use to produce their effect. Nobody carves a bone comb and then stuffs it in a corner and never uses it. These objects are evidence of people who cared, consistently and deliberately, about how their hair looked. Almost certainly because how their hair looked affected how they were perceived by others. Skincare is another dimension that the archaeological record begins to illuminate once you know where to look. Plant-based oils and fats were almost certainly used for skin conditioning by ancient populations, though the evidence is indirect. Fats don't preserve well over tens of thousands of years. But ethnographic research among contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, who provide our best behavioral analogues for ancient human lifeways, consistently documents elaborate skincare practices using available plant and animal materials. Some researchers, including archaeologist April Nowell, have argued that we systematically underestimate the sophistication of ancient human personal care practices simply because organic materials decompose while stone tools survive. The archaeological record we have may represent only the most durable fraction of an ancient beauty culture that was considerably richer than we currently appreciate. Consider also the evidence for hair coloring and styling. While direct chemical evidence of ancient hair dye is extremely rare, we do have evidence for the use of pigments on the body more broadly, and no particular reason to assume hair was exempt from that decorative impulse. In more recent prehistoric periods, within the last several thousand years, we begin to find preserved mummies whose hair was clearly styled and in some cases dyed, across cultures as geographically separated as the Tarim Basin mummies of Western China and the preserved bog bodies of Northern Europe. The styling is deliberate, sophisticated, and clearly socially meaningful. It doesn't appear from nowhere. It represents the visible tip of a much longer tradition of hair as a medium of personal expression and social signaling. Body modification, the deliberate, permanent alteration of physical appearance for aesthetic or cultural purposes, provides perhaps the most powerful evidence of how seriously ancient and historical populations took standards of beauty. Archaeological evidence for deliberate dental modification dates back thousands of years across multiple independent cultures. The Mayan practice of inlaying jade and pyrite into drilled tooth sockets is well known. Less known is that intentional tooth reshaping has been documented archaeologically across sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, often involving filing teeth into specific shapes regarded as aesthetically desirable within those specific cultural contexts. This was painful. It was irreversible. It required skilled practitioners. People did it anyway, because the social and presumably romantic rewards of conforming to their community's beauty standards outweighed the costs. That is an extraordinarily human calculation. Tattooing and scarification leave traces in the archaeological record that are only recently being fully appreciated. Ötzi the Iceman, the remarkably preserved 5,300-year-old mummy discovered in the Alps in 1991, bears 61 distinct tattoo marks distributed across his body, making him the oldest known tattooed human being yet discovered. The tattoos are largely located at joints and areas associated with physical stress, which has led some researchers to propose therapeutic explanations, similar to acupuncture. But the existence of deliberate tattooing at all confirms the practice was established well before recorded history, and in most cultures where tattooing is practiced, its functions include aesthetic display and social communication, alongside any potential therapeutic purpose. The needle and the desire to mark the body deliberately didn't arrive with civilization. They were already there. Now, let's address something that gets overlooked constantly in conversations about ancient attractiveness: the role of the body beyond the face. Contemporary evolutionary psychology research has extensively documented cross-cultural preferences for certain body proportions. Most famously, waist-to-hip ratio research pioneered by evolutionary psychologist Devendra Singh in the early 1990s, which found that ratios indicating estrogen dominance and reproductive health were consistently preferred across a remarkable range of different cultural settings. Similar research on male body proportions finds preferences for shoulder-to-waist ratios that historically correlated with upper body strength and physical capability, traits that had obvious practical value in environments where food acquisition depended on hunting and physical threat required physical response. These preferences aren't arbitrary. They're reading the body as a document of health, hormonal status, and physical capacity. The relationship between nutrition, physical condition, and perceived attractiveness is particularly important to understand in the context of ancient populations, because it substantially complicates any simple answer to whether ancient humans were attractive. A population experiencing a period of abundance, successful hunting seasons, productive foraging territory, reliable water, would have produced individuals with good muscle tone, healthy skin, and visible markers of nutritional sufficiency. A population under severe nutritional stress would show those deficits physically. Chronic protein deficiency affects hair quality and density. Vitamin A deficiency affects skin condition. Iron deficiency produces pallor and fatigue that register visually. This means the question of ancient human attractiveness is partly a question about ancient human ecology, about how well-fed, how healthy, and how free from chronic disease specific populations were at specific moments in time. And that answer varied enormously across different groups, different periods, and different environments. Here's something the conversation about ancient attractiveness almost never includes, and probably should: voice. Research by Benjamin Charlton and colleagues, as well as work by David Feinberg's laboratory at McMaster University, has established that vocal characteristics, particularly fundamental frequency and voice quality, function as powerful attraction signals largely independent of visual appearance. Men with lower-pitched voices are generally rated as more physically dominant and attractive by women, across multiple cultural settings. Women with higher-pitched voices during certain phases of the menstrual cycle are rated as more attractive by men. These voice characteristics are driven by sex hormone levels, testosterone in men, estrogen in women, which means they honestly signal hormonal health and reproductive status in much the same way that facial symmetry signals developmental stability. Ancient humans heard each other before they saw each other in many social situations. Voice was always part of the evaluation. Movement is the other largely invisible dimension of ancient attraction. Research by biological anthropologist William Brown and colleagues has documented that humans can accurately judge health, physical fitness, and even certain personality characteristics from watching how a person moves, independent of what their face looks like. Gait analysis studies find that certain movement patterns, those associated with physical vitality, confident posture, and efficient movement, are consistently rated as attractive across diverse observer populations. An ancient human moving through a camp, returning from a successful hunt, or demonstrating skilled craftsmanship was being evaluated constantly on dimensions that no skull reconstruction can ever capture. Attraction in ancient populations, as in modern ones, was a full-body, multi-sensory experience playing out in real time across the entire social landscape. The social and behavioral dimensions of attraction deserve particularly careful attention because they're the piece most dramatically undersold by approaches that focus purely on physical features. Cross-cultural psychology research consistently finds that traits like demonstrated competence, social generosity, and reliability within the group function as major drivers of attraction, in many studies rivaling physical appearance in their impact on mate desirability ratings. For ancient humans living in small bands, where every individual's skills directly contributed to collective survival, demonstrated competence carried enormous weight. The person who consistently made tools of exceptional quality, or who showed particular skill in tracking game, or who proved reliably generous in sharing resources during lean periods, would have accumulated social capital that translated directly into mate attractiveness. Skill was sexy. It probably has been for a very long time. There is, embedded within all of this, a dimension of the question that deserves explicit acknowledgement. The enormous cultural variability layered on top of the stable biological foundation we've been discussing. Written historical records, which become available starting roughly 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, show us beauty standards that are simultaneously familiar and alien. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri contain recipes for cosmetics, remedies for grey hair, and treatments for skin conditions, testifying to a culture deeply preoccupied with personal appearance. The aesthetic ideal documented in Egyptian art, with its emphasis on slender limbs, wide shoulders in men, almond-shaped eyes, and smooth skin, reflects both the underlying biological signals we've discussed and a layer of specifically cultural elaboration that was unique to that time and place. Ancient Greek thought about beauty is particularly revealing because it was one of the first cultures to explicitly theorize about it. The concept of kalos kagathos, literally beautiful and good, linked physical attractiveness explicitly to moral virtue and personal excellence in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities, but made perfect sense within Greek social philosophy. Greek sculptors developed elaborate proportional systems for rendering ideal human bodies, documented in texts like Polykleitos' Canon, which specified exact mathematical ratios for the ideal male form. What's striking about the Greek ideal, visible in thousands of surviving sculptures, is how closely it maps to the biological signals we've been discussing throughout this documentary. Symmetrical features, clear skin implied by smooth marble surfaces, body proportions indicating physical fitness and health. The cultural packaging was Greek. The underlying preferences were Paleolithic. The most recent chapter of this story involves what might be the largest-scale attractiveness research ever conducted: the behavioral data produced by the global online dating industry. Companies processing tens of millions of daily interactions across enormously diverse user populations have created, somewhat accidentally, the world's largest experiment in human attraction. Researchers who have gained access to anonymized versions of this data have found something remarkable. The same broad preference clusters, symmetry signals, health indicators, proportional features show up reliably across populations that differ in nationality, age, religion, and education. The specific faces that get swiped right on in Seoul overlap substantially with the faces that get swiped right on in Sao Paulo, Lagos, and Stockholm. The cultural differences are real and measurable, but the underlying convergence is more striking than the divergence. The same engine is running everywhere. This modern evidence creates a kind of temporal bridge that reaches all the way back to the beginning of our story. The attraction system that drives those dating app choices didn't arrive with smartphones or social media, or even with written civilization. It was calibrated over millions of years of evolutionary pressure in environments nothing like a smartphone screen, in African savannas and European forests and Asian river valleys, where the stakes of mate selection were existential rather than recreational. The brain doing the evaluating today is functionally the same brain that was doing the evaluating when a member of a small Paleolithic band looked across a fire and felt something shift. Different packaging, identical engine. What forensic facial reconstruction ultimately gives us, imperfect and estimated as it necessarily is a way of meeting that ancient person across the fire not as an abstraction or a category or a stereotype, but as an individual face. The reconstruction of a 45,000-year-old Homo sapiens woman whose remains were discovered at the Pestera cu Oase site in Romania. The painstaking recreation of a young Neanderthal woman's face, which stunned many viewers with its unexpected approachability. These aren't definitively accurate portraits, they're informed approximations. But they're the closest thing we have to actually seeing who was there. And consistently, what they show us is not the grunting monster of popular imagination, but a person. Specific, individual, present. It's worth sitting with something genuinely important that emerges from taking all of this seriously. The diversity of ancient human appearance was real, substantial, and probably far greater than our reconstructions currently capture. Ancient Homo sapiens populations had already spread across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia by 50,000 years ago. They were adapting to radically different environments, under different selective pressures, over generations enough to produce measurable differences in body proportion, skin tone, and other physical characteristics. The ancient world was not populated by one type of human face. It was populated by an extraordinary range of human faces, in the same way that the modern world is, each one evaluated by the people around it using the same ancient biological machinery, filtered through whatever specific cultural context gave it meaning. And here, perhaps, is the most honest final thought this question allows. We ask, were ancient humans attractive, as though the answer might reveal something reassuring or unsettling about our own nature. What the evidence actually reveals is something simultaneously simpler and more profound. The desire to be found attractive and the simultaneous impulse to find others attractive is not a modern vanity or a cultural construct or a byproduct of consumer capitalism. It is one of the most ancient, most persistent, most deeply embedded features of human psychology we possess. It was operating in the minds of people who had never seen a mirror, never encountered a written language, never heard music played on any instrument more complex than a bone flute. They looked at each other. They felt drawn toward some faces and less drawn toward others, for reasons their conscious minds couldn't fully articulate. They decorated themselves with ochre and shells and carved bone. They combed their hair. They cared. Deeply, consistently, across an unbroken chain of generations that runs all the way from those ochre-stained hands in a firelit cave to every person alive on the planet right now. The desire to be seen, and seen as beautiful, whatever that meant in whatever world a person was living in, has been part of what it means to be human for longer than we know how to fully measure. And that continuity, once you actually feel its weight, is one of the most quietly astonishing things about our species.